There was an appetite for it internally. And once, particularly, stakeholders within the C-suite were kind of seeing what I could produce or what could potentially be produced by a RevOps team that in theory has a purview, across different departments and whatnot, it was super appealing, to them to kind of get some of that insight basically and to have somebody that's sort of looking over the fences, so to speak, and can kind of see, well, we have this problem in marketing basically, but it's really a disconnect with sales basically.
This is Sales Ops Demystified, the number one most downloaded podcast in sales operations. We invite the brightest minds in sales ops onto the show to deconstruct the what, why, and how behind rep productivity, forecasting, metrics, and all things revenue. This podcast is brought to you by Ebsta, a revenue intelligence platform used to identify risk in the pipeline and score customer engagement, and is sponsored by the Global Sales Operations Association and the UK Revenue Operations Network. Hello and welcome to another very special episode of the Sales Ops Demystified podcast. Today we're joined by Evan Luke, who is currently a Revenue Operations Director or Director of Revenue Operations at VanillaSoft, and also has a background in marketing. I'm very pleased to learn. Evan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Evan, it's actually rare that we have a sales or RevOps person onto the show that has the background in marketing. And so my first question is to understand, first, why we decided to transition, I guess, out of a marketing role or marketing career into an ops career supporting the three commercial functions.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. For me, so I view marketing as fundamentally three components. It's creative, it's analytical, and it's technical, at its core. For me, I felt my strengths were really more on the analytical and the technical side. So as a marketer, right, you need to be able to conceive the campaign. So you need the creative side. You need to be able to actually implement it. So it's technical. And then you need to be able to analyze the success, right? And I think it was in those two core components of the implementation and the analytics that really appealed to me and where I was successful. And I think that was, as time went on in my marketing role, I kind of got more and more involved in the analytics, not only for marketing, but also just across the organization. And that's kind of what made it sort of a fit. And so I was almost an entrepreneur in that regard and kind of developing that function within VanillaSoft, and it kind of bloomed into the role that it is now for me.
So you experimented in marketing, realized that part of the role maybe you didn't enjoy or wasn't your greatest strength, and then transitioned or created your own role that better fed your working desires.
Yeah, I think there was an appetite for it internally. And once, particularly, stakeholders within the C-suite were kind of seeing what I could produce or what could potentially be produced by a RevOps team that in theory has a purview, across different departments and whatnot, it was super appealing, to them to kind of get some of that insight basically and to have somebody that's sort of looking over the fences, so to speak, and can kind of see, well, we have this problem in marketing basically, but it's really a disconnect with sales basically. And it's kind of translating, we're either losing revenue or we could be generating more in certain places, right? Because quite often that analysis, I think, is limited to, okay, we're looking at sales, or we're just looking at marketing, or we're looking at customer success and the different, metrics that, success might be looking at their churn or something like that, right? Whereas marketing is just looking at the number of leads they're generating, right? When you have somebody who can look, between those parts, it all becomes that much more efficient.
Did the sales or RevOps function exist at VanillaSoft before you decided to create it?
No, in no capacity did it. The company's grown quite a bit since I've been here. So we went from probably around 50 people to we're just under 100 now. So I don't think it was something that would have been there necessarily out of the gate. It's not for a lot of companies, particularly earlier stage ones. It kind of comes with more complexity within the different departments and whatnot. And sort of, I think as we grew, and things got more and more complicated, there was a desire for it, and I just basically helped helped kind of evangelize the cause, basically, and, turn it into what it is now.
And so then it would be great if you could just break down the extent of the support and sales team size that you guys are supporting, and then the breakdown of your internal ops team if there are more resources within revenue ops.
Yeah, so the sales team right now is about 10 people. And then RevOps at the moment is myself and then 2 full-time. And then we have various contractors that we may refer to here and there, basically. But it's a relatively, from who I've talked to, not around probably a typical ratio.
And do you think that it's more advantageous, and this might be a stupid question, do you think it's more advantageous to move into a RevOps role from with a sales background or with a marketing background, or do you think it doesn't matter?
That's a tough question. I don't want to get myself in trouble on that one. I think, so marketing for me, I see an advantage there. And one of the big things is I think there's an easy sort of trap to fall into when it comes to marketing of just assuming that everything that marketing does constantly needs to be tied back to a deal or back to discernible revenue. That's not necessarily the case. There are some things like branding, for instance, that you may not necessarily see that direct connection. And having somebody who kind of recognize that, who is also, their purview basically is to analyze marketing activities, I think gives a little bit of a basis and a little bit of context for what might be going on. And that translates in really interesting ways. For instance, we were just talking to a vendor about a renewal. In theory, so part of my purview might be to, we look after the tech stack, right? So part of my purview is to be in the renewal process when we're looking at the different platforms, kind of justify the costs and whatnot. But we actually got to the end of the renewal process. We looked at the contract, we looked at the composition, we looked at the cost, and we thought, you know what? For this price, this is probably not worth the benefit that we're going to get out of it. There's only a really small portion, basically. And we got to the end, and we said, hey, we're not going to renew. The vendor that we were in the conversation with actually came back to us, and we started getting calls from the CEO directly. And basically what the CEO was saying, hey, I don't want to lose your guys' label, right? And all of a sudden the conversation just completely changed, right? The numbers changed, the composition of the contract changed. All those variables that we were looking at completely changed. And we ended up back, and we're actually just in the process now of signing it. So it's the little things there. And so we had a more favorable contract, plus we also saved some money in the process, basically. And part of that is, the branding that we got there. So it doesn't always materialize in the ways that you think that it's going to, but I would argue there are some things that are happening that are really important. Having that recognition, I think, is a huge strength. So, for me, there are some things on the sales side that maybe I don't intuitively understand, but coming with that and that uncommon kind of background, I do think it's very valuable, and it's as you say, uncommon.
Evan, you have absolutely nailed a big trend in marketing at the moment, in my opinion, is that commercial leaders try to tie an ROI back to every marketing activity, but they ignore the potential brand benefits. And the example you gave is so interesting. I've never thought about how brand can actually obviously brand can make you money, but it can also save you money. And it's also weird because when I saw that we were engaging with you for this interview, I somewhere have heard of VanillaSoft. Now, I actually don't know, maybe I'm mistaken, or maybe I have been exposed to the brand somewhere in the past 5 years, right? And that's because there's been a marketer involved.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, and that's our big thing, right? So we're sales engagement software. And there are some, 500-pound gorillas basically in the space right now. It's become super popular over the past, 5-10 years. The theory basically is, we operate, in conjunction with CRM and marketing automation, right? For us, being, a smaller company, not necessarily with the same amount of funding, not with the same amount of resources, branding is a huge tool for us, right? To be able to get in some of these conversations and to be able to do things like, expose different people to it, and have that. And that pays dividends in the long run in a big way, I would argue. So, it just benefits in action.
Going back to the tech stack point, could you share, if possible, a couple of the tools that you guys are using in the revenue function? And then also you mentioned on your LinkedIn profile about how you have a skill set or an ability to eradicate unused tech. So it would be great to hear about how you go about doing that.
Yeah, so the core of our tech stack really is Salesforce. We use our own homegrown product, VanillaSoft, as well. On the marketing automation side, we use HubSpot, and then recently, as part of we've shifted from an inbound to an outbound model heavily, and so we're using Terminus to conduct account-based marketing. As well, we just actually went on with Seismic. We use Sales Intel for data. We use Sales Navigator and some different stuff, and we're also just in the process of experimenting with Clearbit as well to append some data. When it comes to sort of looking at platforms and figuring out what to do, so I mean, the first thing I think you have to do in RevOps or sales ops or whatever, any role where you're looking at a tech stack basically is go speak to different department heads, basically get a sense of the tech stack, and then ask for, any underlying, contracts that may be applicable. And I think in the process of doing that, one, you get a sense of the cost, but two, you get a sense of what's actually being used in the feature set, basically. So going back to the conversation that we had with a vendor that we initially decided we weren't going to renew with, we decided, for looking at the contract and how it was composed, there was a piece of it, the piece that was being used was only about 14% of the cost. There was another 86% basically that was there that we were going to be paying for, and we weren't really necessarily using or leveraging, nor did we really feel that it was compelling to be using within, the marketing strategy. So there was only really that small component, and that's kind of where we thought, well, okay, the benefit really is not worth what we're actually going to pay for this, basically, and that was, the catalyst to walk away from it. So it's just getting analytical and looking back at the contracts, asking the questions, basically, and trying to understand and practice in action what's actually being used. Because quite often, these product offerings, vendors get clever, basically, with how they will put some of these together, and they'll have different products that they'll kind of combine in different places. Some are more commonly used, some are less commonly used, basically. But also use cases vary. So understanding all those different variables and how they come together, I think is compelling to understand when to get rid of something, but also if you're trying to negotiate as well, those can be valuable, insights to bring to the table for those discussions.
Makes total sense. You also mentioned on your LinkedIn profile about your ability to whip a broken process into a seamless customer experience. And I must say, I do, like you also have background as a journalist, and so I can appreciate your ability to use good words there. Could you share, if possible, an example of how you've done this?
So I would actually go back to when I first arrived at VanillaSoft. One of the pieces of our mandate basically was to take a look at marketing rationally, basically, and figure out what was working and what wasn't working. So one of the things that we did right off the bat was took a look at the mandate at that point was to basically generate leads. So what we were doing basically is looking at how we could, in conjunction with that as well, building the brand. So one of the ways that we kind of looked into doing that basically is figuring out, the stack that was applicable and the actual logistical processes that would go into building, the content that was basically going to help us, do this. So we ended up, I was the only full-time staff for a bit, basically, but we built a team, including, a digital producer around that. We built different contractors into the process, basically, to help, conceive that and everything. But the part that I think was the toughest, basically, was then tying that back to sales, basically. So how do we deliver these, right? This data that we have, or these leads that we've generated and whatnot, and looking at the systems and their capacity to do that. So at the time, we were just using, HubSpot, basically, and VanillaSoft, but tying the two systems together, basically, was a huge part of the challenge. And as well, I think just the communication element. And that came down to, so, there's always these technical elements to it, but there's also the logistical kind of, service level agreements between departments as well, and kind of understanding, what's going to be delivered, when it's going to be delivered, the composition of what's going to be there, setting expectations between the two places. So I think there's a fair amount of, and I think you've talked about this in the past on the show as well, is, there's a certain amount of soft skill that's kind of, involved in the process as well, but also that technical side. So I think my kind of strength is understanding sort of both of those. And one of the things that I've even talked about the past as well is just having like a translational, ability as well, and kind of communicating some of this stuff and contextualizing, some of the analytics, some of the numbers, some of the systems and everything to different people in the organization who maybe don't have the same background. And having that, I think, is a real gift and something that people, particularly with an analytical mindset with myself, I think it's not the most common thing. You're thinking of, you're dealing with somebody who's commonly thinking, in logical terms or something, but they're not really thinking of what the translation, might be to somebody else who isn't thinking the same way. So that's one of the areas where I think I have a strength, and I try to exercise that as much as I can.
And do you have any sort of particular tips for how you can identify broken processes? Any kind of things that normally jump out at you?
So I think going back to one of the first things I think you need to do is go and interview with, key stakeholders, spend, a couple of hours ideally sitting down with these people. And one of the things that I look for in particular is conflicting expectations, right? So you ask people to describe their process. You also ask people, somebody in sales, for instance, to describe the marketing process or what their expectations of marketing are. When you see those disconnects, when you see the differences, those are the points that you really want to hone in on and basically understand how it got to be that way, and that's what I look for, at its core primarily. I'm just looking for basically the disconnects right off the bat, and I think that's the first thing that I actually look to fix typically is things between departments rather than the actual departments themselves. Quite often those departments are capable, I think, of resolving those things, but it's just some miscommunication that's kind of happened, and that's where I think the power and the beauty of RevOps really comes in, and being able to sort of look between basically and, figure out the places where things have just broken down totally.
It ties in with something I learned while studying system theory. There's a concept in system theory that states actually, if you're trying to improve the output of a system, don't look at the parts, look at the interactions between the parts. So that really resonates there. Again, so as an extension to your strength on the analytical side, you also mentioned on LinkedIn that you have an ability to get buy-in from stakeholders, which I think is on the other side, it's on the softer skills side. So if you could share one tip with the audience on increasing buy-in from, let's say, revenue leaders, if you're in a RevOps function, what would that be?
So plainly stated, learn their personality, learn the language that they speak, right? So understand the background the person is coming from and understanding how they're operating, understand how they're compensated, right? Understand how they derive pride from what they're doing and be able to speak to that. That's the single biggest thing, I think, because again, quite often, I see a lot of younger people in particular, they'll be brilliant analytical minds, they'll have, a remarkable capacity to, spot patterns and information, understand and everything. Being able to translate that over is significant. So even when I talk, for instance, to my CRO and everything, who also comes from a marketing background, I'm probably having a different conversation than I would with my director of sales. Those are just two different ways of speaking, basically, and understanding how those people are compensated, what their expectations are, basically, what their background is, and what the best way to kind of convey and communicate the information is. And part of that coming from a journalism or communications background, right? Quite often, I think that comes from, writing stories about, different topics that are happening. You have to have a certain capacity to take, information that may not be the most intuitive to your reader, right? And be able to kind of communicate that, to them and distill it down into a digestible format. So that's kind of what I try to do. The other thing I think that really helps as well is transparency, right? So when I talk about systems, when I talk about patterns in the numbers, one of the things that I really try to do is contextualize that with what I call crosswinds, basically. So if we're forecasting, one of the things that I'm looking at not only is the pipeline velocity, I'm not looking necessarily just at what stages everything is in, but I'm also looking at, how often are these deals getting pushed back or pushed around, basically? How often are we changing the goalposts? Breaking that down, getting that granularity as well. So when I speak to this, I'm saying, okay, so superficially, if I have, this amount of deals or this amount of revenue sitting in proposal or negotiation or something like that in those two critical stages, that's great. But at the same time, we need to look at this rationally as far as there's, the potential that some of this gets pushed back or around, in some way, basically being able to understand that and having that transparency, I think, is really valuable because it helps set those expectations right and helps build trust as well between you and your colleagues. So I think that element is super important as well.
Beautiful. Final question. Who in the world of revenue operations would you most like to take for lunch?
So I'm not sure this falls strictly within the world of revenue operations, but I've been rereading Predictable Revenue recently. I think Aaron Ross might be kind of a compelling conversation for me, just because one of the interesting things about that book for me is it goes back and forth almost seamlessly, basically, to sort of strategic and theoretical stuff about SaaS more broadly, which is very much my background at this point, all the way down to the individual tactics of how to execute on basically an outbound strategy, for instance. And it also ties in as well with our organizational transition recently, more from an inbound to an outbound model. So I don't know. I think that'd be a really interesting conversation for me.
It is a classic. Now, everybody listening, I want you to be aware that Evan had no idea about any of the questions we were going to ask today, and he took them all completely in his stride and gave some pretty awesome, insightful answers. So we can tell that Evan is the real deal. He's a true RevOps ninja. And it was also very interesting for me specifically, and I hope for the audience, to get the insight of revenue operations from the marketer's perspective. And it is also interesting that your CRO is also from a marketing background, and also actually quite, encouraging to see that from a marketer standpoint, because typically it's just the salespeople that get to those roles. So Evan, I want to thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for sharing all of those gems.
Hey, thanks a bunch for having me. Appreciate it. It was lots of fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sales Ops Demystified podcast. If you are listening on a podcast listening application, then please subscribe, rate, and review. And if you have any questions about the show, if you know a guest, or if you have any questions about sales operations, just hit me up at tomhunt@ebster.com. That's tomhunt@ebster.com.